I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. Morn came and went, and came and brought no day, and men forgot their passions in the dread of this, their desolation.
205 years ago, a volcano on West Nusa Tenggara, Indonesia, changed the world. It destroyed an entire ethnicity, wiping out their culture and language for good. It sent the world into a winter that lasted a whole year, causing famine and disease to spread all over Europe and Asia. The explosions lasted for 3 months and could be heard all the way from Maluku to Sumatra. Halo semuanya, selamat datang lagi di hari ini dalam Sejara Indonesia. Aku mau buat series ini tentang sejarah Indonesia karena banyak orang di dunia ini tidak tahu tentang sejarah Indonesia, and I think they're really missing out on something interesting. Nature has always played a part in human history, whether it is just subtle changes in the temperature, or whether it's huge massive eruptions like Mount Vesuvius in Pompeii. It's always been there. It's always affected us. In the island of Sumbawa, volcanic activity had increased, and it seems like the local people knew something was wrong. Dense black smoke and ash had been pouring out of the volcano for the past 3 years. The ground shook from quakes deep within the mountain. Eventually, the residents of Mt Tambora asked the Dutch administrators in the nearby town of Bima for an investigation. The Dutch belatedly sent a man by the name of Israel to go and investigate the phenomenon. The man arrived a few days before the eruption, which killed him and everyone on the mountain. However, volcanology was still a developing science, and people didn't really understand how volcanoes worked. So I don't think that poor Mr. Israel's report would have done a lot of good.
Bunyi bahananya sangat berjabuh. Ditempuh air timpa habu. Berteriak memanggil anak dan ibu. Disangkanya dunia menjadi kelabu. Asalnya konon Allah Ta'ala marah. Perbuatan Sultan Raja Tambora membunuh Tuan Haji menumpahkan darah. Kuranglah pikir dan kira-kira.
So who was this lost culture exactly? Who were the people that lived by the volcano? There are only a few accounts of the people who lived on Gunung Tambora before the explosion. These people were described as Papuan-looking and woolly-haired by British explorers. They rode horses, lived on the mountain, and they spoke a language that was completely different to all the languages around them. Before the eruption, the island of Sumbawa can be divided into 3 language groups. On the western side of the island, people speak a language very similar to Sasak, the language of Lombok. This is close to Balinese and Javanese. On the eastern side of the island, people speak languages that are closer to those of Timor and Flores. These languages are very different to those spoken on the western side and are in fact closer to Fijian than they are to Sasak and Javanese. Sandwiched between these 2 larger language groups is the Tambora language. It's fascinating to note that this one small island could hold 3 different language groups. Now, because we only know 48 words of Tamborese and have no living speakers of the language, it's very hard to know where the language came from and which language group it belongs to, although we do know it does not belong to either the Western Malayo-Polynesian languages or the Central Malayo-Polynesian languages. The two most likely places where the Tambora language could come from is either the Mongkomea language group, spoken in parts of India and Bangladesh and various islands around the Indian Ocean, or it could be a Melanesian language similar to those spoken in Papua and other parts of eastern Indonesia. Accounts of the Tamborese looking similar to Papuans helps support this theory. The Tamborese were successful traders in spices, sandalwood, and sapanwood, which is used for making incense. They were actually a surprisingly wealthy kingdom and were able to control these luxurious resources well. We know this because they left behind a lot of bronze and jade objects that were quite expensive, and many of which came all the way from Cambodia and Thailand. Nowadays, there are no Tamborese people, there is no Tamborese culture, and no Tamborese language. All we have left of their language and culture are 48 words written by a British explorer, and the remains of some of their villages. Although the Dutch did try to help by sending that guy Israel to have a look at the volcano just before it erupted, they may have also had a hand in the demise of the Tambora kingdom. Let me explain. It seems from accounts of the time that eastern Indonesia after Dutch settlement was not doing so well. Not good. Problematic. Especially for the Tambora kingdom. The Tambora kingdom was under the protection of the Sultanate of Goa in South Sulawesi. Now, the Sultanate of Goa and the Dutch had a little bit of a problem with each other. You see, the Sultanate of Goa wanted to trade with everybody. British, French, Arabs, Chinese, anyone with money who wanted to buy things from eastern Indonesia. The Dutch were not fans of this. They wanted to be the only customer and the only seller. Free trade wasn't really very popular with European empires of this era. So they simply couldn't have this sultanate selling everything to anyone. It would make their enemies, the British, the French, and the Portuguese, more money. So the Dutch brought in the big guns, and they blasted the Kingdom of Goa to smithereens. They then forced the Sultan of Goa to sign a humiliating peace treaty and give up all his armies and navies. Unfortunately for Indonesia, these soldiers and sailors did not just find a new job. Well, they did. They became pirates. Really good pirates. These Bugis warriors with besmirched honor and no job went all over eastern Indonesia, plundering, looting, and stealing anything that wasn't nailed down. They became the famous pirates of the celebs. Because of these constant attacks and constant raids on their community, the Tambora people were forced to move away from the coast and up into the mountain. It was easier to defend their community on the slopes of the Great Tambora Mountain. However, although they were further away from the pirates, they were closer to the crater of the volcano. A huge explosion was heard across Indonesia, all the way from the Maluku Islands to South Sumatra. The sound of explosions continued for the next 3 days. Huge white-hot ash clouds known as pyroclastic flows burst out of the volcano and barreled down the mountains. The extreme heat of the pyroclastic flows raises the air temperature to above 300 degrees Celsius. Everyone in the area would have died instantly. before the ash clouds even touched them. And even if you were sheltering under a concrete bunker, the extreme heat of the air and the poisonous gases around you would have cooked your lungs the instant you took a breath. All the plants and animals on the island perished and became silent. The entire mountain was reported to be covered in liquid fire, and pumice stones up to 20 centimeters in diameter fell from the sky all around the island. Clouds of ash coated Bali and South Sulawesi and fell as far west as Jakarta. What was once one of the tallest mountains in Indonesia lost over a third of its height. People noticed a dull metallic smell in the air. Black rain fell all over the country, killing plants, animals, and people indiscriminately. We do not know how many people died as a result of the volcano. However, we can guess that around 70,000 to 100,000 people died. At the time, the Dutch East Indies were being run by the British. And this was because the Dutch were on the wrong side of the Napoleonic Wars. Amazing how much a little French man can change the entire globe. The British sent a man by the name of Lieutenant Phillips to go and investigate. Now, the governor of Batavia, Sir Simon Raffles, was perhaps more interested in the scientific discoveries that could be made. However, Lieutenant Phillips did also make note of the people and the suffering that took place after the volcano.
I passed through nearly the whole of Dampo and a considerable part of Bima. The extreme misery to which the inhabitants have been reduced is shocking to behold. There were still on the roadside the remains of several corpses, and the marks of where many others had been interred. The village is almost entirely deserted and the houses fallen down, the surviving inhabitants having dispersed in search of food. Since the eruption, a violent diarrhea has prevailed in Bima, Dampo, and Sangir, which has carried off a great number of people. It is supposed by the natives to have been caused by drinking water which has been impregnated with ashes.
The following year, people in the Northern Hemisphere realized that the sky was unusually yellow. All day, every day. The sun was no longer shining so bright. In fact, you could look directly at the sun and see black spots moving slowly across its surface. People at the time had no idea what was going on. People believed that the sun was dying and that the world would end. Panic and looting spread across all the major European cities. The eruption of Mt Tambora had pushed so much volcanic ash into the atmosphere that it stopped the sun's light and heat from coming to the northern hemisphere. This caused the strange phenomenon of snow and ice forming in mid-July, which is usually the northern hemisphere's summer. In Switzerland, an ice dam formed, blocking major rivers. Rains lasted for over 8 weeks in Britain and Ireland. Italians and Hungarians reported red snow forming on the mountains. The summer was the coldest in recorded history. The troubled European continent, fresh out of the horrifying Napoleonic Wars, now faced one of the worst famines in recorded history. Rioters marched into granaries and bakeries holding signs saying, "Bread or blood." Meanwhile in Asia, the delayed summer monsoons caused torrential rain to build up, flooding the Indian subcontinent. This flooding then led to a cholera outbreak, which spread all over Asia and into Russia. As a stark reminder of the power of diseases, This cholera outbreak actually killed more Indonesian people than the volcano itself. Right now, Indonesia has over 76 active volcanoes dotted all across the archipelago, thus giving it the unenviable title of place most likely to experience a deadly volcanic eruption. Indonesia has experienced many devastating volcanoes throughout its history, and in the future there definitely will be more. The population of Indonesia has grown dramatically since 1815. It is now the 4th largest country in the world, and Java, which was affected by the Tambora eruption, is now one of the most densely populated islands in the world. If the Tambora eruption were to happen again in the modern era, around 8 million people would be directly affected. Thankfully, Mt Tambora is not in immediate danger of erupting anytime soon. However, it is still being monitored very carefully. Gunung Merapi, on the other hand, a volcano in the middle of Java, is very active and could have a much larger eruption. As recently as 2018, the mountain erupted, forcing everyone in a 5-kilometer radius of the mountain to evacuate. It has been very active in recent years. For locals in Merapi, the constant earthquakes and smoke from the mountain have become a part of everyday life, kind of normal. I can't help but wonder how many Tamborese people thought that the eruptions and the earthquakes that they experienced from Mt Tambora were also normal and regular occurrences. Indonesia is not as helpless in the face of Mother Nature as it once was. We do not have to rely on Dutch administrators sending some guy there the day before an eruption, and we do not need to have British explorers come for scientific purposes rather than humanitarian reasons either. However, in the 2018 eruption of Mount Merapi, many people in the surrounding area failed to evacuate, and for others, simply because they couldn't afford to leave their livestock and property behind, even for a short period of time. If people have the knowledge of Indonesia's volcanic history, we can respect the awesome power of these events. If all this talk of disasters and volcanoes has left you feeling really helpless, remember there are actually things you can do right now. For instance, organizations like the Red Cross and the HHRC are always looking for donations for their disaster relief efforts. Donating before an emergency can actually be really useful, because that way an organization can use the funds to prepare for a disaster and to train and equip staff.